Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch event of the Global Recovery Observatory. This launch event is made possible by the United Nations Environment Programme and, of course, the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and Environment in partnership with the UNDP, with the IMF, the GIZ, the German Ministry for Environment, as well as PAGE. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute pleasure to serve you today as your moderator. We're connected from every corner of the globe to witness the launch of an incredible knowledge tool that is in the form of the Observatory. This is a tool that is not only going to give us unprecedented access and transparency into government COVID-19 spending, but it also puts power in the hands of public policymakers as well as their citizens as we think about how do we make better decisions around government spending, whether it be for COVID-19 or whatever else faces us in the emerging horizon. And so the key question that we're going to be asking today is, are we building back better? And this also happens to be the key question of the just launched UNEP and Oxford report on that very same question. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I do have standing by an incredible panel, but also some speakers who are going to give us some of that context. What I do want to say is that this is a truly global conversation. We're streaming live on LinkedIn, on YouTube, but most importantly, this is a global conversation where your voice matters. So please send me your questions, send me your comments using the Q&A function, and I'll try to the best of my ability to actually integrate your voice into this conversation. And so with that said, it's my pleasure to hand over for some welcoming remarks, a duo in the form of Professor Cameron Hepburn, who is, of course, the director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment. And he is going to be presenting alongside and giving us some opening remarks with Brian O'Callaghan, who is the lead of the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project. So Cameron and Brian, it's over to you for now.
Nozi, thank you for that marvelous introduction and welcome everybody. Unfortunately, not to Oxford in person. It would have been lovely to have you all at the Dreaming Spires for a classic lecture, drinks and dinner combination that's hard to beat. Look, many of you will know that last year, including with Joe Stiglitz, Nick Stern, Dimitri Zangelis, Brian and I wrote a paper in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that looked at the question of could we build back better? Could we take this pandemic with its dark clouds and find a silver lining that could put us on a trajectory towards net zero emissions and living in peace with nature? And what that work showed was that this is not only doable, it's attractive, it makes sense from an economic point of view. Now, since then, we're now over 6 months later, we're still in the thick of this pandemic, but we have seen some good signs. We've seen some ambitious contributions from a group of nations, as this report and the Observatory will make clear, but it also shows that there is an awfully long way to go. And there are some missed opportunities as well. Now, I'm not going to spoil Brian's thunder or the thunder of the panel. I just want to welcome you today to this launch of the Global Recovery Observatory. It's a fantastic collaboration, not just with Oxford, but with UNEP, with UNDP, with IMF, with GIZ and with PAGE. And it's the power of this collaboration that is going to be shining a light on efforts everywhere to build back better so that we can answer the sort of question that we're answering today. Are we actually building back better? And with that, over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Cameron. Well, let's start at the end. Many governments are missing significant economic opportunities in their recovery spending, and it is not good enough. Government recovery efforts are so far incommensurate with the scale of the planetary crises of climate change, of nature loss, and pollution. It seems like the world is trying to put out a house fire with a garden hose, while a perfectly good fire hydrant is available just next door. Today, I speak as an economic researcher, I speak as a former engineer, and I speak as a young person. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated global populations, particularly vulnerable groups, And instead of doing everything in their power to set up long-term prosperity, governments, in many cases, are just trying to return to the old normal. In our report released today, and I'll bring up some slides as I'm speaking, we introduce the Global Recovery Project, the Global Recovery Observatory, rather, which is a project to bring transparency to government spending practices. And it's really, as I like to call it, the world's tool. The observatory tracks government spending in over 50 countries, 89, in fact, by the end of March. We have near 4,000 policy items in there and 30,000 data points. The observatory also uses a new comprehensive 100-page methodology to try to assess the potential social and environmental impacts of that spending. And all of it, the methodology, the data, plus some rather sexy visualizations, are being released publicly today. And we'll post a link in the chat momentarily. So this project was launched by Oxford and it's maintained by Oxford, but it's also supported, as Cameron mentioned, by ever generous partners, including UNEP, the UNDP, IMF, GIZ, and PAGE. And I need to also, at this point, give a special shout out to some of the names behind the scenes: Stephen Stone, Joy Kim, and Himanshu Sharma, who've been central to the development of the project. And of course, to M. Murdoch, who's my brilliant co-author from Harvard University for the report. Now let's cut to the chase. $14.6 trillion. That's what we saw in global spending announcements from the largest 50 countries in 2020. It's hard to grasp just how big that number is. It's equivalent to the size of China's GDP, or giving everyone in the US $45,000, or, if it were possible, buying 5 billion houses in rural India. Vitally, we need to understand that the far majority of the 14.6 trillion has gone to short-term rescue initiatives rather than long-term recovery initiatives. And that's not at all a bad thing. Recovery spending is essential. It's designed to keep businesses and people alive. Vaccine funding, unemployment payments, and business liquidity measures. Recovery spending is where governments reinvigorate their economies and have discretion. That's therefore where we focus our attention in understanding greenness. So overall, we find that $341 billion, or 18% of recovery spending, is green, and thereby positively supports environmental outcomes, including climate change. But the remaining 82% is not, and in many ways, that 82% perpetuates the status quo, which is obviously misaligned with our long-term climate aspirations. So much of that non-green spending reflects, in our view at least, significant missed opportunities. But there is hope. As health systems begin to recover and populations are sufficiently inoculated, the opportunity for focused recovery efforts is significantly enhanced. Rational economic actors would be investing right now in opportunities that best set up future prosperity, opportunities with a high bang for every taxpayer buck. To be future-oriented, you would try to seed new industries, those likely to dominate future trade. Green energy, green transport, natural capital solutions, the list goes on. These will all be central to the future functioning of society. In many ways, it doesn't actually matter if you believe in climate change or not. The economic argument is sufficiently strong to prompt action in and of itself. And in developing economies, green spending can support rapid sustainable development, which is oh so needed. Now, throw in the fact that targeted green spending can create more jobs and helps to reduce social inequalities. And, it seems that the answer to a prosperous COVID recovery is rather clear. We have a nearly 70-page report trying to expound those benefits released today. And a message to the many politicians and policymakers in attendance: we encourage you to go, to explore, and reach out when you'd like to hear more. Now, the core chart from our paper is this one. It highlights how much governments have been spending on recovery on the x-axis there, and how green that recovery has been on the y-axis. The purpose of our work isn't to compare countries, but it is to provide a wake-up call to the citizens of those countries that are falling short. I'm from Australia, and you can see how woeful Australian recovery action has been to date. So for me, that's a push to make some noise about it and engage productively on better, more job-heavy solutions. So we find that there have been significant missed opportunities to date, but the focus is really on the future and what a bright future it will be if governments prioritize prosperity supported by inclusive and green societies. Now, overall, emerging market and developing economies haven't spent with quite the same vigor as advanced economies, but that's not at all their fault. Despite bearing some of the greatest burden from COVID-19, these nations haven't really been able to spend, particularly developing and least developed countries. On screen, you'll note that where advanced economies on average for all spending, this is, spend $20,800 per person. Emerging and developing economies have spent only around $700. And in some of the least developed countries, we're talking $10 per person or even less. Now, that disparity is a serious global risk, and one which we shouldn't take lightly. Developing economies risk backsliding, some say up to a decade in development, increasing poverty. And we've already seen poverty increase for the first time in 2 decades over the last year. The impacts of that are significant, they're debts. Advanced economies must step up urgently in long-term partnership with the Global South, and they need to do so immediately. Concessional finance and grants could be explicitly linked to climate projects. And in that way, you'd be supporting development, you'd be reducing poverty, and you'd also be making progress against climate change. Now, this is where I'll close. Our 3 key messages are: 1, green is good for the economy; 2, governments must better prioritize green spending or lose significant economic, social, and environmental opportunities; and 3, advanced economies and multilaterals should be partnering with emerging markets and developing countries now to bring both those development and the climate actions I talked about. For government representatives in the audience, use the Global Recovery Observatory to understand how other nations have been spending green. And to citizens in the audience, use the Global Recovery Observatory to hold your leaders to account. And that's it from us.
It's a massive thank you to you, Brian, and of course to Cameron as well. You've given us a fantastic frame and a reason to get excited about the conversation that we're having today. I love the analogy of a fire hydrant. Let's put the hose pipe down and pick up the fire hydrant. We've got the tools and the resources. Let's get it right. Now, what I would like to do now is quickly introduce my panel who are rearing to go. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our UNEP Executive Director, Madame Inga Anderson is here with us today. We're also joined by the Managing Director of the IMF, Madame Kristalina Georgieva. What an absolute honor to have her with us today. The Minister of Environment from Germany, Her Excellency Minister Svenja Schulze is here with us today. Welcome, Minister. We're also joined by the Director General in the National Planning Department in Colombia, Luis Alberto Rodriguez, and he'll be joining us shortly. But also, last but certainly not least in this conversation, it's a pleasure to introduce economist and Nobel laureate, Mr. Joseph Stiglitz, who I'm sure is going to have some really incredible insights and thoughts to respond and to put his voice forward on this. So I'm going to start with Madame Anderson, because Inga, you've spoken quite openly about a triple planetary crisis. You've spoken about a crisis in climate, a crisis in nature, a crisis in pollution. You've said these all are resulting from unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. And so the question to you is, why is the work of the Global Recovery Observatory important to UNEP, and what are the key results from your perspective?
Well, thank you. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be on, to speak with the minister, but with Kristalina, with Joe Stiglitz, and with Luis Alberto Rodriguez. It is just so wonderful. And these are strong voices coming from different on-ramps, but very much pushing in the direction of a green future. Look, we at UNEP, we speak about these 3 planetary crises: the crisis of climate, the crisis of nature and biodiversity, and the crisis of pollution and waste, the toxic trail that humanity is leaving behind itself. And we speak to how are these created? They are created by our own unsustainable consumption and production. But we need those wheels to turn to get the economies to work, to get jobs and opportunity and growth. So how are we going to get those wheels to turn and turn in a manner that we can reduce poverty and do all the right things, but not do that at the expense of these 3 planetary crises right now, as we will hear from people who are better at this than I. We are taking an extraordinary amount. We saw all those zeros, 14 trillion, and I believe that doesn't even include the US package yet, out of the pockets of the future, because these are borrowed money, and we are putting that into the economies. So for goodness sake, let us not do that with the engine of driving further environmental destruction. Therefore, this observatory, this partnership with these good people who we just heard from both Cameron Hepburn and of course Brian O'Callaghan, who've done, and Joe Stiglitz, who was part of the first paper and really has given great guidance here, allows for countries to see, and it was IMF that started with the tracker, let's not forget, allows the countries to see, what's my neighbor doing? How did that work? And get a sense of, if you like, a sort of menu of options. And look, not every Brazil is going to have different solutions to Guinea-Bissau, but it's about doing elements that can lead us in the right direction. So we are very excited about this, and we can see, and this will be my last point, having, if you like, someone who's external to, in an academic setting, doing this work gives it an unassailable, it just sits. It is there in academia with partners, yes, but having Oxford University involved and the Smith School gives it a lot of value. Let me stop here. So.
Thank you very much, Madame Anderson. I love the use of the language. It just sits. It anchors, it gives credibility. And I mean, you reiterated a point that Cameron had made earlier, that this is not about comparing necessarily, but it is about galvanizing momentum and to say, look at what others are spending and let's look at the impact of that. So, Mr. Stiglitz, let me come to you. I know we've got limited time with you, so I'm going to try and cram in as many questions as I can. I want to start off with your quick reflection on the report. We know that there's a lot of work still to do. But in your view, what are the key tools that you think we should be using to make sure that we are moving decisively towards greener rescue and greener recovery? Your thoughts?
So first, let me thank you again for participating and pick up on what Inga just said, that the amounts of money that are being spent are enormous. And we have to make this money do double, triple duty. We're not only facing all the environmental crises that she described, but also an inequality crisis and a health crisis. And so the money has to, our resources are still scarce, and we have to make sure that what we spend does double, triple duty. There are two major tools that we ought to think about: how we allocate the money, what sectors, how we design projects to make sure that they are, in their design, reflect our concerns about inequality, about environment. And one of the points of our report was that you could do that and actually build back faster, stronger, that these are not conflicting objectives, these are complementary objectives. There's another element I would add, though, which is we ought to be thinking about more conditionality. Normally, I've been very critical of conditionality, but sometimes conditionality can be helpful. So, for instance, when the French government gave money for the airlines, it said, if you're going to do that, you have to lower your carbon footprint. Yeah. Sort of give them a little shove, push to go in the right direction. And that seems to me the kind of thing that governments ought to be doing. It shouldn't be just a blank check of, as we say, $14 trillion. That's a lot of money. When you're giving that much money, and the world has never, governments have never given that much money before, we ought to be giving the money in ways that help reshape our society and our economy in the direction that we need to have it reshaped. And that's all within the framework of building back better, not going back to where we were in January 2020, but going to the direction that we've all been talking about for a long time. And this is a real opportunity to do that.
So, allocation, design, conditionality, just some of the tools that you're saying are sitting in our toolkit that will allow us to build back better, faster, stronger. So maybe let me go to Madame Kristalina, because I want to bring in the question of climate change and green recovery, but to ask the question, how does this relate to the work of the IMF in the context of economic and financial stability?
Great to be with all on this panel. And let me answer your question, how that relates to the work of the IMF in one word: indispensable. We cannot have macroeconomic and financial stability without environmental and social sustainability. And these are the issues that we need to learn fast how to integrate in economic policy. So we come out on the other side of this crisis with less inequality. And by the way, the risk of increasing inequality is very real and very present. And definitely more capable to deal with the abrupt shock that climate change demonstrably is imposing on our societies. Let me make 3 points. One, what does that mean for us at the IMF? What it means is that in our function of looking at the health of national economies and the world economy, we must integrate climate change. And that is to say that the technical term is Article 4 consultations, that in Article 4 consultations in our surveillance function, we take into account both opportunities to reduce the risks of climate change in the future. In other words, how to bring down emissions, how to integrate that in economic development. And also we have to factor in the opportunity for green growth. How can we create more jobs and better opportunities by investing money the right way, not the wrong way? We have to be clear that climate risks to financial stability are very real. They are both transitional risks. If the economy shifts away from carbon-intensive industries and the financial system is slow to adapt to that, that could be a massive shock. And it is also because financial institutions need to know what is their exposure to the climate crisis that is already upon us. We have to integrate climate in our capacity development. Central banks and finance ministries ought to be better equipped to factor climate, to factor broadly sustainability in their decision making. And last but not least, data. Information is power. We are now working on bringing carbon intensity in quarterly economic reports. Very important for a country to look at its growth and say, hey, we may be growing 5%, but our carbon intensity is going up. That is actually not very healthy. I am very proud that the IMF is a partner in the Observatory, because learning from each other is the fastest way for us to make good use of money for the transition. My second point is I'd like to know that we aim to build back better. But I also want us to build better before. We have to integrate climate in decision making. I actually prefer the phrase build forward, because it is about the structure of the economy, our capacity today to put it on a sound footing. And last but not least, Joe, I lived long enough to hear you talking about conditionalities in that positive way. I do agree that we have at the IMF, we have responsibility in the way we support programs to make sure that it is done with the objective of green, digital, and equitable growth for the future. And I would invite Joe to come and talk to us about the conditionalities he supports. Thank you.
Madam, you've raised so many incredible issues, but one of the things I'm just going to lift up is you started off with the word absolutely indispensable, and I think that has been the critical theme that is rising to the surface. But we are talking about ensuring that we are mitigating risks to against financial instability and making sure that we are shoring up the health of economies. Which brings me then to the question to Minister Schulze then. And the question, Minister, to you is, why is green recovery strategically important for the German economy?
Thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to be in this very female panel here today. So thanks a lot for that. So as a government, we are faced with a choice. We can perpetuate our old economic and social structure with traditional economic recovery plans, or we can invest in a sustainable and inclusive future. And this economic stimulus package that creates an opportunity to speed up social and environmental transformation, and they can help our societies emerge from this COVID crisis more sustainable and more resilient. And the greening of recovery measures provides really the opportunity to accelerate the social and the environmental transformation, and do that in line with the 2030 agenda, with the Paris Agreement, and rather than looking in investments into unviable infrastructure and technologies. And the current pandemic, I think, clearly highlights the correlation between nature conservation and the protection of human health. And to mitigate the risk of future pandemics, we need to conserve biodiversity, and we need to protect our ecosystem, and we need to do that more effectively. And these considerations, which are certainly also of economic nature, have prompted us to design the German economic recovery package to accelerate the transition to a climate neutral and environmental sustainable future. And at the same time, the package promotes economic sectors such as green hydrogen and battery cell production, and these sectors hold a great potential for the future. So I am very pleased that in Germany and the EU we have made it our goal to be climate neutral by 2050. And we do that in December, in the middle of the pandemic. And the EU leaders also decided to raise the ambition of the EU's climate target. By 2030, we plan to lower our carbon dioxide emission by at least 55% compared to 1990, and the previous target was only 40%. So under the German council presidency, we worked hard to ensure that the EU COVID's economic recovery package, as well as the next multi-annual financial framework, are also aligned with the objectives of the European Green Deal. And that's what we do. And studies like you can exactly at the right time, as they provide fact-based, they provide evidence that climate action is not as at odds with economic growth. On the contrary, we need to say that designing the measures to be compatible with environmental and social interest provides strong and effective impetus for growth and for employment. And so I'm very happy to be here today.
Minister, what a fantastic response, because you've really lifted our eyes to really think about future resilience and future pandemics and how we would be able to respond to those. And that to the extent that we are recovering green now, we'll be more resilient as economies if we get that right. But you've also touched on jobs, and that then brings me to the Director General Rodriguez, because DG, if we go to Colombia, maybe you might speak to us about how green recovery supports Colombia's socio-economic aspirations, more specifically, how this relates to job creation and the reduction and elimination of inequality. The floor is yours, Director General.
Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to share this panel, a female panel with very important colleagues, and an honor for me sharing with you some stuff about Colombia. Well, I would like to thank you and of course taking the question. Basically, as you know, emerging market has been deeply shocked with the COVID-19, and of course the inequality in the shock is evident. In the case of Colombia, the unemployment raised to historical levels, the GDP dropped to historical levels also, and our effort has been putting in going back, but also going better and being better the future for Colombia. We basically design a public policy document. In Colombia, it's called COMPES. The DMP is the entity in charge of these kind of documents in Colombia. And we put 4 pillars. The first one is employment and over job creation. The second one is to protect the households, and of course, the vulnerable and poorest households in Colombia. The third one is the green growth deal or commitment. And that one is exactly we put all the efforts, all the investment that we need to put in the floor, in the discussion in Colombia, not only in the public sector, but only in the private sector, the green economy pillar. And I would like to highlight like 3 things that in our document, and Professor Joseph Stiglitz mentioned one of them, that is the coordination. It's very difficult for emerging markets, for emerging countries and developing countries, coordinate policies in long-term phase. I mean, we can take some decision right now, but later it's difficult to implement it during the following governments and things like that. And basically, the coordination is one of our major problem, like not only in employment creation and job creation, but also in green recovery. The second one is the differences that we have as a country in the national government and the local governments. The national government sometimes have like a future and modern vision of the problems, and of course some of the technocracy have been helping to this. But when you move to the local, I'm from a small city in the north of Colombia, and the difference in the discussion is totally. I mean, that one is the second that I will mention, and the third one is, of course, one of the point is we can make the efforts like a developing country, neither Colombia nor other countries in the region alone. We need some cooperation between us, and that's one of the things that I think this panel and thank you and recognizing all the effort to put this Observatory of Recovery, because we need IMF, we need cooperation of other countries, of the United Nations. We need other minds thinking and pushing the topics.
Fantastic. Director General, I love the fresh take you've taken on this question to say, yes, we are excited, but let's also be very candid about the kind of support and journeying and partnership that we still need. You've spoken about better coordination that is required between ministries, but also bringing the national vision and the local reality a little bit closer together, which is quite important. I'm going to circle back to you, Mr. Stiglitz, because I know that you have another commitment and might be needing to leave us. So I'm going to squeeze you in just for one more question to you. The first one is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the fact that if we look at national polls and global polls, we do see that the majority of the people do support environmental action as a COVID-19 response. So what do you think, what support could we give to policymakers so that they're taking the right actions on the ground? So that's the first part of the question. So how do we better support policymakers so that they are making policy that is responsive to the reality? And then I'd love a quick thought from you on how do we make green recoveries more equitable? How do we make them more just? And those, I think, might be 2 big questions that you could leave us with in response.
Okay. Well, good questions. First, I think the work that the Oxford group has been doing and others have been doing, emphasizing that the stronger the recovery is going to be, and the greener recovery are not in conflict. That these are complementary policies, and so that in fact, I like the way Kristalina put it. It's not just a question of building back; it's going forward, and that we are engaged in. The pandemic was an interlude, hopefully, and it's an interlude that is shifting our direction because it's made us realize our fragility, and it has crystallized attention on these multiple crises that we've all talked about. But we needed to have addressed the issues of inequality, climate before the pandemic. And this is really a moment that has helped us focus our attention on what we should have been doing, but now we know we have to do it. And that, of course, also includes building back, having better healthcare systems. Now, let me come to the second part of your question, the issue of how do we make a more just, equitable recovery consistent with green and climate change. But first part of that answer is climate is part of fair and just. Because if we don't have a green recovery, if we don't have a green future, we are depriving future generations of what is their entitlement, in a sense. We are benefiting ourselves at the expense of the future. And I liked it the way that Brian began his talk, identifying as a young person. I also identify as a young person, but he is younger. And the fact is that it is future generations that are being affected disastrously by our not dealing as forcefully as we should with climate. So there is a basic fairness and just aspect to climate policy. But another aspect of our report was to emphasize that the spending that could help the recovery could also not only help move us towards a greener economy, but also a more just economy, a fair economy. And that is when I talked about in my earlier answer, how you design project, more labor intensive. When you think about infrastructure, where you spend that infrastructure can make a big difference. If you spend it connecting poor people with jobs, you're going to have a stronger recovery. But in the past, we've ignored a lot of the distributional consequences of our infrastructure investment and other public programs. And so just like we need to put the climate effects of all our spending front and center, and that's what the Observatory is doing, I also think that we need to put the distributive consequences of our spending front and center. And the IMF has been doing that in its programs, making us aware that you're not going to have good macroeconomic performance if you have a society marked by a high level of inequality. That means that as we shape all of our policies, expenditure policies, regulatory policies, we have to keep an eye on the distributive consequences of what we're doing.
Mr. Stiglitz, thank you very much for your participation. I know that you have to run, but you've left us with so much, and I think a great anticipation and excitement from everyone to get their hands on the report, because we're really just touching some of the key themes right now. I did make a promise to the global audience, and that was I'm going to integrate their voice. So as I continue now, I'm going to ask my panelists to be as concise as they possibly can, so I can squeeze in one or two questions from our panelists. So let me maybe come back to you, Madame Kristalina, because I think what I've loved about this conversation is really confronting the brutal facts. One of the things that Joseph has just said is, well, what this moment in history has revealed to us is what we should have been doing a long time ago. The question I'd like to bring to you now is, given the hard, the tough business conditions, the hardships that we've been seeing as a result of this pandemic, what then is the right role, but more specifically the right timing for carbon pricing in the green recovery? If we could have that candid conversation.
Well, there is a great Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best is right now. And it is exactly the same when it comes down to carbon price. We should have done it long time ago. The second best time is now. We have run all the possible analysis on the transition to the new climate economy. Cannot happen fast enough without carbon price. And right now, where are we? On average, carbon price globally, if you do it on a global scale, is $2 a ton. Where we should be at this moment is $75 a ton. And if Joe was still with us, he would tell us it has to go up. So unquestionably, we have to move on three elements. One is carbon price. The second one is green stimulus. And the third one is just transition. The reason we are not moving fast enough on carbon pricing is because if it is done wrong, there are parts of society that are severely negatively impacted. Those that are in the carbon intensive industries, of course, will be impacted severely unless carbon price is combined with measures to bring that just transition. We have great examples. I would mention Sweden in Europe. They have had carbon tax now for many, many years at the high, and now it is $127 a ton. It reduced emissions by 25% since 95, while the economy expanded by 75%. We have Canada on the other side of the Atlantic, also introducing around $40 Canadian dollars a ton, kind of a floor for the country, and an ambition to go to $170 so they can meet their carbon neutrality pathway target. Since you ask us to be very brief, let me go to the bottom line of that.
Yeah.
It is politically difficult unless it is done right. When we factor in who needs to be compensated and protected by the pressures that come from carbon price, when we redistribute, we get revenues and then we give it back, then it is possible to move on carbon price. Not all countries are ready to do a tax, which in our view is the most efficient way to introduce carbon price. But all countries can do some form of pricing through trade or fee-based. And to finish my message here is we have no time to waste. Time is right now.
The time is right now. If it wasn't 20 years ago, if that seed was not in the ground 20 years ago, we should be putting it in the seed right now. I know that Minister Schulze, you also are in high demand right now and you need to go. So I'm going to squeeze one last question to you, please, Minister. And that is to try and understand why it's been important for the German Environment Ministry to really lift this conversation to a level of international engagement, because you really prioritize this green recovery and green rescue. Why is it important that this is a global conversation and that you are engaging at an international level?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You all know that the COVID-19 crisis is affecting many areas of our society, but it is hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. And so the problem of the pandemic must be tackled at international level and can only be successful overcome if we work together. And I strongly believe that the threats to human health and the economy caused by the pandemic, they must be addressed through multilateral action. And it is really essential that the mobilized public funds, we just heard about that these funds are channeled into forward-looking sectors. And we need to prevent lock-in effects and support, for example, fossil infrastructure that would not only undermine the achievements of the Paris Agreement, it would also be a debt and economically speaking. So we need a transformation towards greener and carbon neutral societies. And with this in mind, my ministry put together a coronavirus response package that provides additional funding to support projects in 25 developing countries around the world with, I think, 16 different implementing organizations such as UN Partnership for Action on Green Economy page and the NDC partnership. And I think we need these really working together to tackle that crisis.
Minister, thank you very much. You've raised again the importance of the multilateral approach and the need to work together. So I'm going to cheat a little bit now, Inga. I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm also going to sneak in a question from our global audience to you so that I do keep a little bit of my promise. So the first question that comes for me is that, you know, one of the things that we're latching onto is that the observatory is not just about the historical view. It's also about looking forward and giving us data to make better decisions in the future. And perhaps you could just talk to us a little bit about that, how that data is going to be of value and use as we look to making better decisions. And then I probably want to put in a quick question here that's come from Hervi. And the question is, what are multilateral organizations doing to include climate and biodiversity criteria into the recovery package? And is this a way of meaningfully supporting developing economies? So it's two very different questions. I'm keen to hear your thoughts, Inga.
And I, Nosy, will try to do it super fast because I know that we are running towards the end here. First of all, look, the idea of this observatory is very much shaped by what we've seen the IMF done with the tracker and various other initiatives. How can we then put sort of the full green, this is what UNEP brings to the table, right? We work on environment and bring that in collaboration with Oxford really taking the lead in terms of research. And that is phenomenal. So yes, it looks back, but looking back so that we can build forward, exactly as was said by Kristalina. You know, this is about thinking about what measures has worked, what measures have worked. And when you look at assessment, Article 4 assessments, and we can then see, well, these things really worked. And you will see from based on economic analysis, it generated jobs, it generated growth or not. These are the kind of things that we begin to see from our point of view. And this goes to the second question. These three planetary crises, they are not sort of just a nice add-on, they're existential. If right now, we need to think that the largest 20 economies, the G20, emit more than 80% of the total emissions, right? We need to understand that while 126 countries have signed up for net zero, that net zero promise does not deliver yet because the NDCs have not come in with time-marked actions that are closer. These time-marked actions are in the future, which means that based on the 126 countries that have committed to net zero, we're still hitting 2.7 degrees by 2100. That will not compute for a society for the future. Therefore, looking at these measures, looking at taking these measures and folding them in right now. The to-do list that every minister has before COP26 is to look at these measures, look at the finance and the economy, and see how these measures can be taken into the national determined contribution, which is a promissory note, the commitment note that every country will deliver to COP26. Similarly, do so for climate, so for biodiversity and for pollution, to ensure that this is meaningful. So this observatory will have a very, very significant role for governments, and as we heard from Cameron in the opening, also for citizens to holding their governments to account. So, and I don't want to go into the in long, but we should understand that in 2008, 2009, at the earlier financial food, fuel, finance crisis, we were looking at this and there was an opportunity and the world blinked. The world did not do this. So we have history, we have knowledge, and we know what needs to get done. And now we have an observatory that gives us, frankly, the to-do list of how to get it done.
We have the fire hydrant, Inga, that was put in our hands at the beginning. Director General, let me come to you very quickly. When you spoke earlier, you did a fantastic job of lifting some of the challenges that are not only unique to Colombia, but most likely our experience in developing economies more broadly. The question to you is that as we talk about support from multilateral organizations and support from partner countries, what might that look like? And that, I think that might be a good way just to really get to some of that practical detail. What might that look like? And I hope, Harvey, that also answers your question that you've sent to us to say, please help us understand what the support looks like. Director General, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I will say that definitely, I'm going to just use an example to make the point. For instance, when we started the government 2 years ago, I used to be the Deputy Minister of Finance of this government, was my previous job. And I remember when we started looking to the graph and the numbers of the Venezuela migration shock, it was huge over the table, under the table. I mean, in the formal sector, but also in the formal sector. And when you started the discussion, what we saw is, for instance, in the fiscal rule scheme that we have more or less 2 decades ago in Colombia, 1 decade to be honest, but 2 decades in the discussion, we didn't include the shock in the fiscal rule. So we couldn't spend as much as we needed, and even we were doing during the past 5 years because we didn't have the numbers. So what I'm using this example because at that point, I remember in the Minister of Finance, the IMF in the Article 4 meetings that they used to come to Colombia and these kind of things, they help us to include in the fiscal rule the discussion. And we make it like a clause for the migration shock and this kind of thing. That was wonderful. I mean, it didn't solve the problem. It wasn't money even, but it was helping us to understand the problem, the shock, and how to deal with that. We need right now, and not only Colombia, and we've been working with the United Nations, with the OECD, with the World Bank, with the IMF, but I think the emerging countries need more support in the multilateralism environment because we can spend as much as we need right now. And it's basic. I mean, it's basic macroeconomics. Our GDP debt ratio is increasing double times that we used to have before the pandemic, basically. And we can spend more, even if the only thing is collecting more taxes and this kind of thing that are very difficult at this point. So we need, like in the migration shock that I used as a sample, we need really right now, like in the multilateralism environment that help us not only with money, it is dealing, for instance, with the credit agencies, dealing with the discussion in the Congress that is very difficult sometimes to include not only the pandemic problem, but the green problems, the recovery problems, and all the thing that we need right now. Thanks.
Did you? It's an excellent answer, and I'm going to close off And I'd really love to give Madame Anderson, Madame Georgieva, Madame Schulze an opportunity to close this conversation by responding to a question. And I'm going to literally give you a minute each to respond to this question. It's a question from Abdullah Alim. And Abdullah says, what makes us so hopeful and so optimistic that we can achieve a green recovery in 2021 when we failed to do it after the global financial crisis? Now, Madame Inga has pointed to Madame Georgieva to say she must go first. So that's absolutely fine. Then I'm going to Germany and I'm going to land, I believe you're in Nairobi, Inga. So I'm going to end closer to me, not too far from where I am. Let's go to the IMF first. Madame Georgieva, where does your hope and optimism come from for a green recovery?
But first, what we see in this crisis is much faster, massive response. We learned from the global financial crisis that we need to lean forward, and we have seen a mobilization to protect people and the economy on a scale and with the speed done by central banks and finance ministries that is truly remarkable. In other words, we act. And then second, this crisis makes us all sober about our interdependence, and it has brought the climate crisis more in focus. I worried in the beginning of this crisis that climate will drop out of the agenda because of COVID, but the exact opposite has happened. And I am very encouraged by the multiple global conversations, including this one, that are saying we understand that we are part of nature, that Mother Nature would not forgive us if we don't respect the value of living in harmony with it.
Madame Kristalina, thank you. Mother Nature will not forgive us this time round. So that's where hope and optimism comes from. I've got 30 seconds for you, Minister, and 30 seconds for you, Inga. So Minister, to you first. Where does your hope and optimism come from that we're going to get it right?
I think Kristalina brings it to the point. So just to add one more point, more and more politicians are recognize that it is cheaper to act now than to repair later on. And the industry is on the way to bring the transformation forward. So we have more people on the right side and more people who know we need that transformation. And that makes me very optimistic.
I love that. It's cheaper to act than to repair at this stage. So Executive Director Inga Anderson, you get to take us home with your final comments in response to Abdullah Alim. Where does your hope and optimism come from?
Well, it comes from all that my colleagues have just said. And then I'll just say, look, knowledge, the science has spoken. It's indisputable. The children on the streets, the children, the next generation is demanding it of us. Politicians are listening now because you know what? Climate and environment walks into the voting booth now. And we understand, as we heard from Kristalina, that actually the next generation of jobs will not be those toxic jobs. They will be the jobs of the future. So that's where I find hope and optimism. And let me just thank my fellow panelists because you've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic panel. A massive thank you to the Director General Rodriguez, to, of course, the Managing Director of the IMF, Madame Kristalina Georgieva, to the Minister of Environment in Germany, Minister Schulze, and, of course, our Executive Director, Inga Anderson, and to Joseph Stiglitz in absentia now, who kicked us off in the conversation. I've got just one more thing to ask of all of you that have joined and are connected with us in this conversation, and that is to follow the work of the Observatory. What we're going to be doing next and what you can be expecting is that the Observatory is going to be going to various countries to help them design recovery packages, because it's all about delivering prosperity for all, protecting and nourishing all those that depend on our economy. from a numbers perspective, we're looking at 39 more countries that have been earmarked to be added to the observatory. This includes Latin America and the Latin America and Caribbean region. It includes launching the platform regionally in Spanish by April, so in just a couple of weeks. And we're also going to be seeing the formation of the Forum of Ministers of Environment of Latin America and Caribbean region. So there's lots coming up. This was just the launch event, the first step of a very, very important milestone, and putting this knowledge tool into the hands of every single citizen around the world. A massive thank you to all the teams that came together to make this possible, from Oxford, from UNEP, from GIZ, from IMF, from UNDP, from PAGE, from the Green Fiscal Policy Network. Thank you for all your time. And from myself, on the tip of the African continent in Johannesburg, it's goodbye, and thank you so much for having us.